to have Liz. Our Let's Talk for today is Big Feelings, How to Be Okay When Things Are Not Okay with Liz Boslian. So before I begin, please enter your name and what city you're coming from. Feel free to add in your LinkedIn profile if you want to connect with other folks in our community. We want you in this conversation. For those who are watching this on the live stream on LinkedIn, YouTube, Facebook, and Twitter, we want you in the conversation as well. So introduce yourself and tell us what city you're coming from in the comments. And feel free to connect and ask questions. We want this to be very interactive. So in the conversations, please, speak up. If you have a book recommendation, if you like something that Liz or I says, just mention it in the comments. The focus on today's Let's Talks is Big Feelings, How to Be Okay When Things Are Not Okay. For those who are new to Community of Seven, there's one singular purpose of these Let's Talk calls, and it's to create an environment where you can come in as you authentically are, where you are accepted, and where you can have conversations with other purpose-led leaders to talk about what matters most to you. So for those who are in the live Zoom audience, please turn on your video if you can, because we want you, in this conversation, but also for the speakers, it's so helpful to see a friendly face and a smile and a nod. So if you feel comfortable, turn on your videos. And if one of the speakers or if Liz says something that resonates with you, let us know in the comments. As you know, these are very, very interactive. And before we begin, we always start our calls with a check-in. So if you want, top right-hand side, you can put this in gallery mode. So that you just, we're kind of like in a Brady Bunch square. So before we start every call, we do a check-in. And so I'm going to ask a series of questions. If the answer is yes, I want you to raise both hands like this. If you really agree, you can wiggle your fingers. For those who are watching via live stream, I want you to, in the comments, write yes or no. Okay, so if you're watching on the live stream, yes or no. If you're in the live Zoom audience, turn on your videos. Yes is this. Okay, so first question. How many of you were taught not to show your emotions and feelings when you were growing up? How many of you have difficulties managing difficult emotions? How many feel difficulty expressing emotions at work or have expressed difficulty showing emotions at work? How many of you gone through intense stress in the past 2 years? And last question, how many of you would like to find better coping skills to deal with negative emotions? Awesome. So top right-hand side, if you can put this into speaker mode, and you should probably just see me right now. So today's discussion for our Let's Talk is Big Feelings, How to Be Okay When Things Are Not Okay with Liz Boslian. From longer work hours to increased demands at home, the pandemic has introduced new stressors and uncertainty in our lives. It was during this period where I first stumbled upon one of Liz's illustration on LinkedIn, and I was so moved by her illustrations. She has this way of conveying empathy and vulnerability combined with storytelling in such a simple and powerful way that is, I think, truly unmatched. I'm going to show you a few of her illustrations right now. Some ones that really resonated with me. And in the chats or the comments, or if you're watching us on the live stream in your comment section, I want you to react to them. 1 word, 2 words, whether you agree or not. Okay, it's going to be a fun game. So first one. Who can relate to this, right? Just be resilient, COVID, burnout, hate crimes, uncertainty, and more, right? And then let me find the next one. Unclear priorities, ridiculous requests, uncertainty. And I love this illustration. A great manager, right? Defined roles, clear expectations. I mean, just the way you have so much information packed into this one illustration. when what's ahead feels daunting, and remembering what you've already overcome. When everything feels overwhelming, just focus on this one thing, one step at a time. Don't measure your life with someone else's ruler. Pick your path. And if you start today, opposed to if you start when you're ready, and this is probably one of my, I'll end this with one of my favorites because I totally relate to this parenthood mood swings. I think I'm at the I'm done stage right now. Awesome. So today's guest, Liz Fosslien, is an expert on how to make work better. And she's also the duo behind the best-selling book, Hard Feelings, with her co-author, Molly West Duffy. They now have a book entitled, and I'm so excited for this, Big Feelings, How to Be Okay When Things Are Not Okay. If you haven't bought the book, buy it right now. And after you read the book, make sure you comment, because that's how, you know, the algorithms find you. But make sure you not only buy the book today, but you also leave a comment after you've read it. But they explore emotions that are particularly difficult to overcome in this book: uncertainty, anger, burnout, comparison, perfectionism, despair, and greed. But before I introduce Liz, in the chat, and those watching on the live stream, I want you to answer in the comments. Don't press send till I tell you. Answer this question in the comments, and then I'll do a countdown. What emotions are you feeling right now? What emotions are you feeling right now? Just type it in. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Press send. And we're feeling impatience, stress, burnout, stress, worry, stress. Oh my gosh, everyone, why are you stressed and burnt out on this call? Anxiety. Wow. I mean, it's calm. We have thank you for the person who's calm. But isn't it, and I will tell you, I'm feeling a little bit not stressed, but like a burning anxiety, but I don't know, there's no particular reason like for it. Maybe it's the economy. Maybe it's the fact that my car just got hit like a few weeks ago and I have to find a new one. But like, it's so comforting. Not that you want other people to feel negative emotions, but it's comforting to know that it's not just you, right? And it was so surprising for me to see that so many people are feeling anxious and burnt out, because sometimes it feels like it's just you. Have you ever felt that, right? And I was just talking to a good friend this morning, and I was just like, things in my life are good, but I feel a sense of like underlying stress and turmoil. And it was hard to explain. But, you know, as I was talking to her, she was like, me too. And I think this is why it's so powerful that, you know, Liz and Molly wrote this book, because I think all of us are kind of collectively going through these emotions right now. And sometimes it's biological, physical, and sometimes it's what we're actually going through. But I think there's a lot of practical tips on how to deal with your emotions as well. So I'm so excited to introduce Liz. Let me get her on, spotlight her right now. If I can find add pin. Hey Liz, how's it going? So Liz is a co-author and illustrator of the Wall Street Journal best-selling book, No Hard Feelings: The Secret Power of Embracing Emotions at Work. She is also the head of communications and content at Humu, where she focuses on how to use behavioral science to make work better. Her Liz and Molly's Instagram page, follow it if you haven't done so already, has over 500,000 followers. She talks about well-being, leadership, motivation, emotions at work, and employee engagement. She regularly leads interactive workshops about how to effectively harness emotions in the workplace. She's spoken at organizations like Google, NPR, Viacom, and the list goes on. Her work has been featured by TED, the New York Times, Glamour, and The Economist. Drum roll, please. Welcome, Liz Fosslien. Hi, Liz. So excited to have you.
Hi, thanks for having me. I'm really excited to chat with you and everyone.
Yeah, and so, before everyone came on, we got a chat on the phone, and I was just, such a big fan. You've inspired and so many people just with your illustrations, and I know I have reposted many of your content. So, you and Molly co-wrote Big Feelings, and also your first book, No Hard Feelings. What's the story behind how you two met, and what made you decide to write a book about these two topics?
Yeah, so I was when I think it was like 2014, 2015, I moved to New York City where Molly was living, and I didn't know anyone, and I had this very big stereotype of New Yorkers that everyone was going to like race past me on the sidewalk and be really mean. And so I asked all my friends to set me up on like platonic friend dates. And Molly was my first platonic friend date, and she was not mean. And we really bonded. We actually both have a really hard time sleeping. So the first thing we bonded over was like the earplugs that we wear, sleep masks, white noise machines, just like our really intense sleeping routines. And then as we started talking about deeper things, we noticed that we had both had these experiences where our first jobs after college, we entered thinking that we could not fuss, we could not fail, and we definitely couldn't feel. And because of that, because we had never learned to tune into our emotions, learned how to like talk to your manager about what parts of your job you enjoy and how you might want to grow into a specific role, we both burnt out of our first jobs, and then didn't really know what we wanted to do next. So that was the inspiration for the first book. We started writing some articles together, and then that eventually turned into the idea for the book. And we really tried to write the book that we wish we had had. So, how do emotions show up for leadership, for communication? Why are they important? How do they actually make great teams? If you feel bad at your job, what are your options? Things like that. And then the second book, it's kind of a funny story. So, the first book, No Hard Feelings, comes out February 2019. And then, somewhat ironically, Molly and I both started to go through essentially like really hard situations later that year. I was losing my father-in-law to cancer. He had a 10-year battle with cancer. He had a stroke at the end. And there's just like there's no silver lining. There's nothing good about that. There's no like try to find meaning in it. I was just like, oh, I'd rather not go through this. And so the next book, Big Feelings, was really what do you do when affirmations don't work anymore, when looking on the bright side isn't an option anymore? What about those really, really intense moments in life? And the funny part of it, I promise there's a funny part, is that we took this book to our publisher in January of 2020. And we love our publisher, but at the time, their response was, this is a really depressing book. Is there an audience for this? Like, does anyone really want to read about like despair and burnout and anxiety and all these different things? And so we threw around a couple of other ideas, but nothing really stuck. Pandemic hits, fast forward to June 2020, and our publisher came back to us and was like, hey, remember that book about big feelings? We think we're ready to publish that book now. Would you want to write it? And we were like, yes, we would. It seems really useful. um, so that was the story behind both, but it's kind of, I like to share the anecdote around the second book because it does, and we actually talked about this before we jumped on the call, show this massive shift during the pandemic, both in our personal lives, but then also at work, of how much emotion not only we are willing to share, but how much we expect leaders, especially, to share with us.
Yeah, and in that conversation before everyone came on board, I kind of spoke. So I'm a different generation, Gen X, and I just remember being in the corporate world, and we were told not to show emotions. And as a woman executive, the higher you got, the less emotions you were, asked to show because
Mhm.
emotions were considered a weakness. So it's just interesting how, like, overnight, just a pandemic has kind of changed the whole way we do business. But also, I think it's also due in part to millennials and the newer generations that are kind of coming in, kind of demanding that no, we're humans, we're not robots, right? So
Yeah.
tell me a little bit about your backstory growing up. Were you taught to show your emotions? Did you always kind of have like this healthy relationship with your emotions and balance? Like that the fact that you're writing this book right now on emotions.
Hmm. No, so my parents are both immigrants. They are both highly academic. And really, my dad especially believed very strongly that to be successful, you kind of just do what's needed to be done. You take the job, you stay there for 40 years, and why have emotions? They're just not useful. And so yeah, I don't remember much emotional expression growing up. If someone cried, if there was a lot of anger or an anger came out, it was just like, oh gosh, what was that? I actually had a really hard time in high school. I just was depressed, and I think my parents were at a complete loss of what to do. Like therapy was just not something they were even familiar with. And the most fascinating so two things. One thing that really has stuck with me that I read of all places in the Wall Street Journal was this woman who was writing about her immigrant parents, and she said, "What I've learned in life is that my parents wanted what was good for me, but that wasn't necessarily what was best for me. And so they
Mm.
were well intentioned, but what's best for me is actually something that I'm going to create for myself." And the second thing that was really interesting to watch was my dad then retired before I wrote No Hard Feelings. So as I was writing this first book with Molly, I remember talking to him about it, and his response was, "I'm so glad I'm retired." He said, "I don't know what's going on in your generation, emotions at work, like, I love you, but question mark, what's happening?" And then the book comes out, and he started flipping through it, and it was so interesting to watch him. And he's very much of this, like, buttoned up, no emotions generation. As he would go through it, he would point out stories and be like, "This happened to me in my workplace, and this would have been really useful advice to have at the time," or "I think sharing in this way actually would have increased my team's performance." And so it was cool to see, you know, emotions at work was a phrase he was allergic to, but once he read stories and there were tactical tips, he actually did open up and see that it would have been really useful. So it was like a cool lens to watch even his opinion of it transform as he read the book.
That is so powerful. And I so relate to you in terms of that immigrant kind of story, in terms of like being raised to kind of be stoic, being raised to not show emotions and just to kind of work hard, put your head down. Um, and I often talk about my background. Like I never heard my parents say "I love you" at all,
Mm,
and I never saw them hug and hold hands, which is so different from my husband, who is Jamaican, and their family is very like
mm,
warm and like and he asked me like, "Did you ever see your parents kiss?" I was like, "No, I've never even saw them hold hands or say, they never told I love you growing up."
hmm
And in my 20s, I think I was in college, I realized I wanted to change that with my mom because my father had passed away in my early 20s. And I kept on telling my mom how much I loved her until she told me it back. Like it probably took like a year or 2 years for her to finally say I
mm,
love you. But in some ways we have to teach people how to treat us in some ways, right?
hmm
And it's so much harder with the older generation because that's how they were raised, to not
hmm
show emotions. And I think what's powerful about your book is that you can break these generational curses, by giving examples, by
hmm
storytelling, through your illustrations, which are so powerful.
hmm
Um, so in your book, you talk about like really seven, emotions that are particularly difficult to overcome: uncertainty, anger, burnout, comparison, perfectionism, despair, and greed. Um, Let's start with two that I think are pretty significant. What are some early signs of burnout? And, as tied to that burnout, how can individuals and teams successfully navigate uncertainty, especially with what's gone down with like COVID? There is so much uncertainty in the world right now. And I think that's why there's a lot of stress. When we polled people at the beginning of this session, there was a lot of anxiety, fear, stress. And I really feel that's tied to uncertainty, not just only in your personal life, but you're seeing a lot of layoffs happening right now. You're seeing,
hmm
Ukraine and Russia. You're seeing our economic turmoil. There's a lot going on. Let's start with the burnout, and then we can go and talk about the uncertainty after that.
Yeah, so burnout has been discussed a lot over the past 2 years, especially, and for good reason. So everyone feeling stressed in the chat, I also just want to emphasize it's a natural reaction to what's going on in the world. It's been a really stressful 2 years. But one of the things I've noticed about burnout is that it's mostly talked about in its most extreme form. So you feel like you have to leave your job, you feel like you can't get out of bed. And one person that I interviewed for the second book, Big Feelings, he's an expert. He works with people going through burnout. And he said in almost every single one of his clients, burnout tapped them on the shoulder with a feather many, 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 many times. And then finally it hit them with the bus. And he said most people will only pay attention when it hits them with the bus. And actually, what you need to be doing is listening to those feather taps. And a couple early signs that people tend to ignore are people that you normally like. Suddenly you find them really irritating. It's not that they're irritating, it's just that you have so much going on. A seemingly small task seems to feel overwhelming. So I remember last summer, I was starting to head into burnout, and my husband asked me to send him a Google Calendar invite for like a dinner we were going to, and I burst into tears. And it was like going to take me 10 seconds maximum, but it was just like one more thing I had to think about, and it was way too much. When you're starting to think of weekends or vacations as a chance to recover, as opposed to opportunities to recharge, to like see your friends, to do all the things that you love to do that aren't work. It's just like, if I just get through this week, then I can be sick Saturday, Sunday, and maybe I'll have it together again on Monday. Like that's a terrible way to live, and that's just not sustainable long term. If the idea of getting like a little bit sick sounds fun, so like not COVID sick, but it's like, oh, finally I have an excuse to not go to that event, to like not be on my email all day. And then the one that's interesting that seems to have resonated most with people is this idea of revenge bedtime procrastination, where it's like you go to bed at 10 or 11, whatever your bedtime is, you're exhausted, your eyes are starting to fall shut, and instead of falling asleep, you like get on social media or you read a book or you're just like on your phone doing whatever it is you want to do. And there's nothing inherently bad with that. It's just when it becomes like self-sabotage because you're not allowing yourself to get the sleep you need, that's usually a sign that it's you trying to like claw back any semblance of control over your time. A lot of people are like, that's the only me time I have. And my response is, well, yeah, that's terrible. Like you should have more me time during the day or on weekends or try to build in those breaks. So I think the biggest thing is just to like be aware of your early signs and truly listen to them and not let it get to the point where it's, oh my gosh, can I ever work this job again? It's like, I need to take a vacation day. I need to like, if I can, like hire a babysitter, ask my partner, ask my family to take the kids for like 3 hours, whatever it is that you need to do to like have some more time for yourself. It's really important to listen to those signs.
And we have some comments also in the, I just want to read some of these. Will, I turned into, oh, I lost it. There's so many comments. I turned into an angry person and didn't recognize myself. I knew I needed to blaze my own trail. I refused to stay in angry mode, right? There's a lot of people who kind of agree with you. Colleen, this completely resonates with me. Um, Kathy, this conversation in terms of the workforce, you know, that boomers kind of had the brunt of it in terms of it's important for us to kind of break generational curses. And Lauren, this is exactly how I felt recently as well. So let's kind of go, we talk about burnout, right? I think that's kind of the big um, buzzword for the past 2, 3 years. You know, burnout has been around for a while, but you've been hearing about it incessantly, probably for the past 2 years. How much is it related to uncertainty? We kind of talked about how individuals can and teams can successfully navigate uncertainty. There's so much going in the world. You know, first with COVID, and now you have war. You have, you know, racial tensions. You have so many like hate crimes. How do you manage all of this? And especially as a leader, how do you manage teams and lead them during this period where people aren't feeling safe?
Yeah, so definitely is tied to burnout. If humans hate uncertainty, there's research that shows we'd actually rather know something terrible is going to happen tomorrow than have a 50% chance of something terrible happening tomorrow. Because in the first scenario, we can plan for it. We're like, okay, I can prepare. And in the second, it's like, well, I'm just sort of spinning in circles. I feel really anxious because I don't exactly know what's going to happen. So, two of the most powerful pieces of advice that Molly and I stumbled upon as we were writing Big Feelings. And in the book, there's a whole chapter on dealing with uncertainty and then the emotion that usually accompanies it, which is anxiety. And on the individual level, it's this phrase, I am a person learning to blank. So, what I noticed at the beginning of the pandemic, my company went completely remote and everything was uncertain. We didn't know when we were going to go back to the office. We didn't know like what's going to happen to the economy, to our jobs. How do we work as a remote team? What are our priorities going to be for the next 3 months? And I put a lot of pressure on myself as a manager to just know everything when in fact nothing was knowable. And so I think those first meetings I kind of came across as very sort of tight and robotic. And then I came across this phrase, I'm a person learning to. And so what I said to myself was, I'm a person learning to be a manager in a remote setting for the first time in an unprecedented global crisis while being terrified about myself and my family and my team. And I don't know where our company is headed over the next 3 months. Really different. It's like, okay, yeah, I should cut myself a lot of slack. That is a ridiculous situation to be in. And so, what that phrase helped me do is shift more towards learning and opening up. And so, I went to my team and actually said, like, hey, we're all learning to work in this new environment, and I need your help. So, we're going to try a couple things. Let me know what's working. Let me know it's not. If you have ideas for how we can reconnect, please tell me. And that actually ended up being much more successful for us as a group than if I had put all this pressure on myself to have all the answers. So if you move to a new place and there's a lot of uncertainty, instead of being like, why don't I have friends yet? Just say, I'm a person learning to find community in a new city. If you are, at home taking care of your children and working a full-time job, it's like, I'm a person learning to do all these things. And at least it's going to help you more easily give yourself grace. So on the individual and team level, that can work. And then for teams, actually, this tip came from NASA, which of all places you would think needs to know with like exact precision what they're doing next. And at the start of projects, they specifically call their projects, they make plans from which we will deviate. So they're setting the expectation at the beginning that they're going to learn, they're going to experiment, and things will change. And what's really nice about that is it actually gets you more comfortable with that uncertainty. And so if things do change, it's okay because you've kind of thought through it. It's like, okay, here's generally what we think we're going to do, but we need to keep our minds open to the idea that maybe we want to go this way and maybe let's plan a little for that occurrence. What if we go the other way? What would that look like? And so there's a lot of value in the preparation and the thinking, but you don't feel so locked in and emotionally invested in this like one specific path because, even in like non-pandemic times, whatever plan you made 3 months ago, if you look back, it probably changed quite a bit. So I also really like this idea of plans from which we'll deviate.
I love that. And it kind of reminds me too, like when I was kind of first starting off in my career and I started becoming a manager, I felt because I was naive that I had to have all the answers. Well, if I'm the
Mhm.
manager, then I need to know everything and I have to always be on point. And it wasn't till I, later in my career that I realized that it was okay for me not to know everything and that
Mhm.
it actually my not knowing things made it okay for my team to either step up or be okay with them not knowing. And so it created an
Mhm.
environment of trust and and when you're in this kind of world of perfectionism or like I need to be omniscient and know everything, it creates an environment that there is a low level of psychological safety in some ways, right? Because if you're always striving
Mhm.
perfection. In your book you talk about, you know, dealing with perfectionism in your own personal life. What has been your journey and what kind of helped you transition from this, state of wanting perfectionism to now being kind of accepting the flaws and focusing on progress over perfection, perhaps?
Mhm. Yeah, I think anyone who's like a high achiever, I hear this a lot too from people with immigrant parents, where it's sort of like you're the generation that they sacrificed for, and therefore you must succeed in this like sort of very narrow definition of success. Um, and the biggest, so early stories from like the first job I had some health issues, and so I was in the ER literally all night, and I was just so anxious about not showing up to work the next day that I went to work, and my boss made some offhand comment like, "Oh, like, you're in here early," because I hadn't slept. And I was like, "Oh yeah, well, I just came from the ER." And I remember he stopped and he said, "What? Like, you need to go home. What on earth are you doing?" And granted, I was lucky to have a boss like that, but just stories like that where I was so anxious about not being seen as a good performer that I went to these absolutely ridiculous extremes looking back. Um, and the biggest flip for me was understanding that my perfectionism was actually hurting me as opposed to helping me. So a lot of people who have perfectionist tendencies, they're afraid to let them go. Well, if I'm going to be perfect, then I'm just gonna like eat Fritos and watch Netflix all day. Like, who will I be anymore? And that's just ridiculous. That's like not what's gonna
Yeah.
happen to you. And the perfectionism is actually about being so afraid of failing that you actually perform worse than if you kind of just relaxed a little bit and enjoyed the process. So psychologists, and this has been what was most helpful to me, differentiate between approach goals and avoidance goals. So a perfectionist will always set an avoidance goal. And this is like, you have to give a big client presentation. The perfectionist will be like, I cannot look stupid. I cannot mess this up. And that is a terrifying thing to have banging around your brain. That's an avoidance goal because you're trying to avoid looking like an idiot. And you're just, you're going to be anxious the whole time. It's not going to be fun. You're going to be nervous. You're much more likely to stutter over your words, to beat yourself up for minor mistakes versus an approach goal, which is saying, like, what would I do if I just gave the best presentation of my life? What would that look like? What if I could just blow everyone's mind with like the cool stuff I've been working on? What if I just had fun with this deck and I designed it in the best, coolest way that I wanted it to be? That's much more exciting. And what's great about these approach goals is like if you actually achieve it, it's awesome. You delivered this amazing presentation. If you achieve an avoidance goal, you didn't look like an idiot. That's not exciting. Like you're never going to celebrate yourself. And so I think researching this more and starting to really understand that this drive that I thought was like responsible for all my success actually had probably really hurt me in the past. Like I probably wasn't being my best. Because I just wasn't like excited about anything. I just lived every day in complete fear, and you're just never going to do your best work or be your best self in that situation. Not that you have to be your best self all the time, but like you should give yourself the chance to. So I think it's set those goals, try to figure out like how you can get excited about something, because then if you do deliver, it's really something to celebrate.
Love that. So in your book, you mentioned that there's a difference between a manager demanding that everyone be mentally tough and helping them take care of their mental health. So, these past few years have proven that, you know, the world is uncertain. We're going through like unprecedented challenges, right? That are beyond our control. How can leaders respond, to make their employees kind of feel safe? I think about that card, the illustration that I had shown in the beginning of yours of the manager with the umbrella kind of protecting
Mm.
his team from uncertainty, stress, all this other stuff. What can managers do during these like uncertain times?
Yeah, I think it starts with just acknowledging it. So, like we've talked about, a lot of managers feel like they need to have all the answers or they need to have everything together all the time. They should be cool and calm and collected. And people are actually much better at reading us than we think they are. So, even if you think you're cool and calm and collected, chances are your team notices when you're stressed, when you're frustrated, all of that stuff. And if you don't say anything, they're just going to immediately assume it's because of something they did. So if you come into the office and I can tell that you're kind of stressed out, but you're not saying anything, I'm just like, well, I'm getting fired. What's going on here? She's not saying anything. This is terrifying. And so I think the first is just acknowledging, but you also don't want to overshare, which can undermine your authority. So saying something like, hey, I just want to get the team together and acknowledge that this has been a really hard month. I know that like even on a personal level, I'm sure many of you have been going through a lot. Work has been really stressful. And so I want to like thank you for your effort and also just highlight that if you have concerns, if there's anything I can do to better support you, please come to me in our one-on-ones, whatever. You can tell them whatever works for you as a team. And then you also want to provide a path forward. So you want to say, here's what I'm going to do over the next month as your manager to try to put some more stability in place to ensure that we have reasonable expectations, that we're not taking on too much. And I will also shield us from other teams in our goal to do that. So you're kind of combining openness with a path forward, which is the best kind of leadership where you're showing some vulnerability, but you're not burdening your team with like so much emotion that they just like have to absorb that all from you. The other thing I would say is I've actually had increasing amounts of questions from leaders and managers saying, do I have to be a therapist now? Like I've started to have more open and honest conversations with employees, and sometimes they just bring things up that I feel like absolutely unqualified to talk through with them. And that is good. Like you should be aware that you're unqualified to have that conversation, and you should not attempt to have that conversation. It's really about saying like, hey, as your manager, like what can I do to support you so that you have the time that you need? And then here are resources that I would advise you take up. So you can point them towards your company's benefits. Many in the US, but like many insurance companies will like subsidize some form of therapy. If they don't, there's like free therapy. They can go to someone in HR. There might be like an employee resource group. So I think as a manager, it's less about you suddenly getting certified as a therapist and more about just like have a complete understanding of your company's benefits, of resource groups, and then point people in those directions. And then also have an honest conversation about what you can do to make sure that their work life is allowing them what they need to stay mentally healthy.
Love that. We have some. I'm going to open it up to questions soon. I'm just going to read some of the comments. Amy, yep, nothing is ever perfect. Like to look at nature and see how perfectly imperfect it is. Yet it's beautiful. When you look at nature, there's harmony. Um, and there's also a great question by Janet Schmidt. Janet, do you want to unmute and ask your question, or do you want me to ask the question on your behalf? Janet?
Yeah, I mean, I was just saying, it's like, how do you get employers to recognize that employees are becoming burned out, that they're having a hard time with the work-life balance? And I don't know, getting them to truly understand that it is affecting you mentally and physically. And like I said, I dread taking time off work because I know I'm going to come back to just a mountain of work.
That's such a great question. Thank you for asking that, Janet.
Yeah, this is a tough one. So a couple pieces of advice, like if you are on a people team or have a friend on like an HR team, uh, this often will show up in retention. So when people are leaving, doing exit interviews and then aggregating all that data and saying like, look, people are leaving because they were burnt out. If there's like a lot of data that supports that, that's a pretty compelling case to leadership. Looking at employee engagement surveys, often that's where these kinds of things show up. So unfortunately, like if leadership is not already understanding that this is a huge issue and that will, if not now, then soon start to affect performance, bottom line, everything they care about, looking for data points. If you don't have access to that, I think really trying to see if there's change that you can make within your team. So if you're a manager, modeling that for your team. So like as a manager, truly one of the most powerful things you can do is take a day of vacation and don't email anyone while you're on vacation. Because you can tell your team over and over again, take vacation, I care about you, I care about this. But if you're emailing them at all hours of the night and you never take vacation of yourself, you're actually not creating an environment in which they feel safe doing that. And one of my big things is that like when we talk about burnout resilience, like it's much easier to be resilient and avoid burnout in an environment that makes it easy. And what I've seen a lot of organizations do is they're like, here's a meditation app. go do 5 minutes of meditation and then come back and you'll be mentally well and we're good. It's like, no, we're not good. That is completely ineffective if the fundamental structure of the organization is like leeching people of their energy and their ability to perform. Um, yeah, I mean, it's it's I think it's a great question because there's not like an easy answer. Otherwise, every workplace would be wonderful and I would have nowhere to speak, which I would love. I would love to like not have a job anymore, basically, because I think that would mean amazing things for the workplace. But I think it's like, are there people within your team? Do you feel like even on a team level, there are things you can do? Can you all come together in agreement and say like, hey, I think often what's useful is talking about the need rather than the emotion. So saying like, if you're feeling overwhelmed, exhausted, saying like, hey, it would be really helpful to my work if I had an afternoon with no meetings where I could just do heads down focus and really deliver something exceptional. As a team, could we agree? Could we find like 4 hours or 3 hours per week where we're not going to have meetings? And usually, like, if you don't know how that's going to go, then like walk into that conversation maybe with like a friend on your team who's going to back you up and say, like, yeah, I would love to try that. But I think it's seeing who you can, sort of use as not use, but like bring in as an ally, and then seeing like what small, seemingly small steps you can take. And then once that gets a little traction, I think people tend to be like, oh, that was great. Like, we should just make that a thing. Or like, what else can we do? Those kinds of steps.
That's great. Does anyone else have a question for Liz? Anyone? You could either raise your, oh, Will, you want to unmute and ask your question?
Yeah. Hey, Liz. Hey, Lan. Hey, everybody. My question goes back, love your thoughts on the generational piece that you talked about earlier. Depending on how I research it, I was like born like 45 minutes after the boomer generation, right? So I don't know where I ever fit, and Gen X is like the lost generation in so many ways. But I learned more in the last 5 years from working with a new generation. So I was blessed to be in a work environment before I started my own thing, to have so many of the things my generation would have assumed. Don't show emotions, stay this way. I was fortunate enough that the environment taught me. So I want to know what advice you have for people who lead people to be open to those suggestions from a new generation instead of sticking to what we know. Like, what do you have tips for people to get out of their comfort zone, I guess, if you will?
Yeah, I think that's great that you were willing to get out of your comfort zone. I think that's really wonderful. And one aside is Molly, my co-author, and I are both millennials. And this was maybe 6 months ago, did a workshop with primarily Gen Zers, so the generation that's younger than we are. And Molly and I were both like, oh my God, are they expressing emotion? So we were like, whoa, like we get it. Suddenly there's this like young generation that's even more open than like we ever have been, which was cool. Um, I think I think there's a couple of things in there. There's one, like you said, yes, being willing to learn from it. Especially there has been this fundamental shift, not just among younger generations. Like over the past 2 years, I've had very traditional organizations reach out to me under like NDAs and say, our managers, their employees want them to talk about emotions. Like, we've never, ever even touched this subject. What do we do? And so I think the first is just like understanding that this is a shift that's happening. And if you have someone, that reports to you, but who seems to be like really good at it, this is like an amazing opportunity for you to better adapt to that shift. And again, become this leader that people want to follow more and more. I think it's to letting people know, like, more and more the research shows people do want a more human connection with their leader. That's who they find inspirational. That's who they're willing to kind of go to bat for, work late for when you need to. Um, and then, yeah, I think also seeing it as kind of a mutual exchange. So, um, I think there are times when like you shouldn't say every single thing that you're feeling in a meeting. There's definitely like a line when you're just a feeling fire hose and you're just causing chaos. And so seeing it as like, oh, wow, they really expressed themselves wonderfully in this situation. And in this other situation, there's some room for mentorship. And I actually think that that mentorship will be better received if you're like, I really appreciated what you did here. But I would, as a leader, you're going to have to like maybe tread, whatever you want to say, like tread a different line. And here's some guidance on like how to do that as you grow in your career. And you'll just have information that unfortunately you can't share with every single person in the organization. But yeah, I think it's cool that you had that experience, and I hope other people are open to it as well.
Thank you.
It's fascinating seeing kind of these generational differences in terms of their approach of emotion at work and just how different it is, like in terms of like, the Gen Y, I guess is it Gen Z? Are they Gen Z right now?
Gen Z is the new crop.
Yeah, like it's so fascinating. Any other questions? Otherwise, I have a question for Liz. Anyone? Let me also kind of read some of the comments right here too. Jesse Perna Elise recommends Beating Burnout at Work, Why Teams Holding the Secret to Well-Being by Paula Davis, has really great resources and frameworks and actionable items. Carrie Barrett says she finds herself in the same shift. She embraces it fully, but it's hard for others to embrace sometimes because it's uncomfortable, which is, that's actually really a good point, like in terms of that uncomfortable feeling. What do you do when you don't know where to start? Like, maybe I'm a boomer, maybe I'm Gen X, and I want to talk about emotions, but where do I go? Where do I start? Like, some people are just better at talking about their emotions than others. Like, for someone who feels really uncomfortable, what would you recommend?
Yes, hold on, I'm pulling up.
Well,
so
first buy your book, your 2 books, and read it.
Well,
Past that.
Molly and I have an assessment on our website that's free. It's like takes 2 minutes to fill out. You can take it if you want to. But basically there we talk about, there is a spectrum of how comfortable you are showing emotion. And it's usually dependent on just like your basic personality, but also how you were raised, socialized, all of that. So on one end, you have under emoters, and these are exactly what you said, people who have just maybe they don't even feel as strongly as others, and they have a harder time opening up. And then on the other end are over emoters. And these are people who are like no poker face. They feel something, everyone around them knows it. People tend to know pretty quickly without taking the assessment where they fall. You can also have even emoters who are in the middle. It's context dependent. If you know everyone really well on your team, you might be an over emoter, but in a new environment, you might skew under. But we all fundamentally have some kind of like base tendency. And so for under emoters, or people who have been taught to be under emoters in the workplace, one of the safest places to start is praise, gratitude, and asking questions. So no team is ever going to hate you if they accomplish a big milestone and you as a manager are like a little more than feels comfortable, be like, that's amazing. Like, I'm really excited for the team. And I'm really impressed by how we all came together and everyone played an equal role. And it's just like such a joy to watch you all work together. And I really appreciate your effort. Like, that's going to go over really well. And it's a nice way for you to start practicing like a little more emotion than feels comfortable. Molly, my co-author, is an under emoter, and she for a while was doing a lot of consulting, and she actually got feedback that initially people thought that she was a little cold because she just didn't have that like, hey, it's so great to meet you. And so she actually has now practiced, like when she first meets someone, it still feels a little unnatural, but she's like, hi, I'm really excited for this project, and like, let's dive in. It's just a pleasure to meet you. And it feels a little uncomfortable for her, but it goes over much better. And it's actually more true to who she will be once she gets to know them a little more. So it's just like figuring out in which situations you can like express a little more. And like I said, it's usually the positive emotions that are easiest to lean into at first. And then also asking a question. So in a one-on-one, if you're the manager, you don't have to be like, I'm exhausted, I did not sleep last night. It can just be like, hey, I really want to support you. Like, let me know, what one thing could I do this week that would help you in your work? And already that's like leading to a more emotionally expressive conversation, even though you yourself haven't like suddenly like opened the floodgates about what you're feeling.
So, in your book, you talk about completing the stress cycle, um, and I laugh about that because I kind of think about usually my natural reaction, having been brought up the way I was brought up, is to not talk about my emotions as soon as negative emotions come up, to try to squash them. um,
Hmm.
Talk a little bit more about completing the stress cycle and why it's important.
Yeah, so this idea was written about actually before we did by the Nagoski sisters, who wrote a book called Burnout that I highly recommend. If you're interested in burnout, like the whole book is about it. And they describe this phenomenon where way back in the day, we stress was like a way to keep ourselves alive. So if you were like there was a lion and the lion was chasing you, you would have this adrenaline rush and you would run away, and then you would kind of collapse, and that would be completing the stress cycle. Is like stress comes, you use it, it motivates you to do something. Hopefully that thing is successful, you're safe, and you can kind of relax and like take a deep breath, calm down, and that's the completion of the stress cycle. In the modern world, there's not like lions hunting us down, but there's a lot of stuff that's really stressful. Like we're just so overstimulated. Like people can message you on across like 16 platforms all the time, all day long. And so we never really have natural moments to complete that stress cycle. It's like I get an email from my boss, I have this adrenaline rush, I email back, then there's another email from this other client. And so I'm just like constantly doing stuff. And so completing the stress cycle, it's really simple things. It's like coming home, not looking at your computer for an hour, sitting down, you know, talking with your partner, doing yoga, taking a couple deep breaths, walking around the block, having a glass of wine, having your favorite snack, like whatever it might be that actually helps you like decompress and get out of this like really frenetic state. Like I bet if most of us checked in with ourselves at like 2 p.m. on a weekday, you would find that you're just like holding so much tension in your shoulders and your neck and your back and your whatever jaw. And so it's really about just like letting some of that go so that your body can have like at least a little bit of a break from this constant onslaught of stress hormones.
We have a few people taking the test as we speak, and we have a few
Mm.
over emoters. So, Amy has a great comment. My parents were immigrants, and I've talked to them about this exact topic. For them, they didn't have the luxury to talk about emotions because it was a matter of survival. So they learned to not show it, and now it's hard for them to unlearn that behavior.
Mm.
Um, what I think we talked about this briefly before everyone joined. How do you and I talked about my mother too, right? How do we talk to our parents about emotions if you want them to be more emotional? Like what is the process, or what have you done? Because I know you mentioned that your immigrant parents didn't talk about emotions. You talked about your dad and how he reacted to showing emotions in the workforce, but your book converted him. Not all of us are going to be able to write a book to be able to communicate to our parents. What are some practical tips you could kind of provide?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is making emotions less scary. So, because my parents never learned or never talked about emotion, things like me being anxious or me being sad for a day were terrifying to them because, my mom was just like, if I would be like, oh, I'm anxious, she would just, it was like, oh my God, what's going on with you? You're expressing this. Something must be deeply wrong. Like, something must be deeply wrong with you. Where do we go from here? And a lot of what I've done with them is just be like, I'm sad today. That's fine. Tomorrow I probably won't be sad. And like, it doesn't make me a sad person. It's just like I'm having a sad moment, and that's fine. Actually, I have a baby, and so having a baby has been really amazing for this, because the baby will scream and cry, and I'll point out to my mom, like, look, he's having a really bad time now because he's hungry or he's just overtired. But like, look, here, I stick the bottle in his mouth. He's great. Like, I think a lot of it is just the destigmatizing our harder moments and like helping everyone, including yourself, understand that, like, yeah, you can have a terrible moment, and not to diminish how bad it is, but it doesn't mean that like you're going to have a terrible life. And so I think that, at least from my parents, that was a lot of what it was. It was like, oh, if there's this anger expression, our relationship will never recover from it. If we have an argument and we really like have a conflict, we will never recover from that. And so starting to have more of these things where I tell my parents, like, I disagree with that. I still love you. Like, it doesn't mean that I'm running away or I hate you. I just don't think you're right on this topic. And like bringing some levity to it, or really flagging again, like, last week I was really anxious about this work thing and I think I'll be able to figure it out. But I'm just letting you know that I was anxious and I feel better now, but it was fine. It's like, it's okay. And kind of, and I've even asked my mom at some points, like, were you ever anxious? So kind of slowly having these conversations. And I love the example that you shared about just like saying, I love you and I love you, and also making them, I think once it stops feeling uncomfortable, or even when it still feels uncomfortable, receiving that kind of love, it just feels really good. Like, I don't think anyone is immune to that, even if they have a complete poker face. Like, everyone likes to be loved, everyone likes to be appreciated. It's like fundamentally wired into us. So I think kind of like, one, exposing them to some of these emotions, showing them that they're not that scary, that everyone has them. It doesn't like mean anything deeply about you as a human being. And two, just like showering them with love and affection and praise and gratitude to kind of show them the upside of being a bit more expressive.
Yeah. And it also reminds me of this quote, be the person you needed when you were younger. Because now
I love that.
Now me as a mother, my daughter is just in the background dancing right now. I shower her with hugs and I tell her I love you.
No, you don't.
Yes, I do. And she's eating an Oreo cookie and dancing to the side. She just came home from school.
So funny. Oh my gosh.
But you could be the person that, the parent that you want, and you could change things. So I know our time is almost up. How do we find you? For folks on the phone, make sure you buy the book right away. Go on Amazon. After you read it, make sure you write a review. How else, Liz, can we follow you on Instagram? How else can we help?
My mom made a book.
Yes. Okay, thank you.
Instagram is at Liz and Molly, and then LinkedIn is the other big place where you can just search for Liz Fosslien and find me there.
Awesome. And everyone knows the deal. Go into gallery, turn on your video cameras, unmute yourself because Liz deserves a round of applause. Turn on your video cameras,
Thanks for having me.
Unmute yourself. Woo-hoo, Liz, thank you so much. That was so powerful.
Thank you.
This book is amazing, guys. Make sure you buy it pronto. And thank you so much, Liz, for coming out and on your work trip. What do you want to do? Oh, she wants to do a reaction. Thank you, everyone. She just gave everyone a heart. She wanted to give everyone a heart. Hold on.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Liz.
Bye,
everyone.
Bye,
Thank you.
Morgan.
Bye.